It started with a letter, just a plain, white envelope slipped under our door like any other HOA notice. No fanfare, no warning. Inside was a single sheet of paper typed in a tone that felt less like neighborly guidance and more like a cease and desist from a bureaucratic overlord. Effective immediately, the notice read, outdoor cooking, grilling, smoking of meats, or the use of any fire-based cooking equipment was prohibited within the community limits. No exceptions. No clarification. No vote. Just a rule, sudden, sweeping, and absolute. Most of us in the neighborhood were blindsided. There hadn't been any recent fires, no complaints about smoke, no known incidents that might have prompted such a policy. In fact, BBQs had long been one of the few communal rituals that brought this otherwise buttoned-up subdivision together. Weekends were our time to unwind, fire up the grills, swap stories, and share plates across property lines. Whether it was ribs, corn on the cob, or just hot dogs for the kids, the smell of charcoal and mesquite was woven into the rhythm of our weekends. It was ordinary. It was ours. And then, in one stroke of policy, it was gone. The strangest part? The HOA board didn't say why. The letter didn't cite any safety violations, environmental concerns, or complaints from residents. It simply stated that the board had voted to enact the restriction for community safety and uniformity. That phrase, community safety and uniformity, became a running joke on our street. What did uniformity have to do with a Weber grill on a Saturday? What was unsafe about someone roasting marshmallows in their own backyard? The vagueness of the order made it feel less like protection and more like control. Some neighbors speculated it was about aesthetics. The board had become increasingly obsessed with visual conformity in recent months. One resident got fined for planting tomatoes in her front yard. Another received a warning over a non-regulation wind chime. And now, apparently, a visible puff of smoke from a grill was deemed a threat to the uniform look they were chasing. But this time, they had overstepped. The pushback was instant, though disorganized. Text chains lit up. Group chats turned into digital town halls. People were angry, confused, and eager for answers. But the board remained silent, offering only that the policy would be revisited at the next quarterly meeting. That wasn't good enough. For a rule that impacted virtually every household, there had been no discussion, no town hall, no democratic process. Most of us didn't even know such a vote was being considered, let alone passed. The whole thing felt shady. It also felt deeply personal. For many of us, grilling wasn't just about food, it was about family. It was tradition, identity, and the last reliable excuse we had to see each other face to face in a neighborhood increasingly swallowed by screens and schedules. To take that away without reason, without warning, and without consent felt like a betrayal. The HOA had always been strict. No trash cans visible from the curb, grass trimmed to exactly 3 inches, house paint pre-approved from a narrow palette of beige variations. But this was different. This wasn't about maintaining curb appeal. This was about regulating how we lived, how we gathered, how we celebrated. And the worst part was, they didn't seem to care what it meant to us. As we stood in our driveways, staring at idle grills and silent patios, there was a common feeling brewing beneath the frustration. It wasn't just about meat on a flame. It was about power. It was about whether a group of unelected volunteers with clipboards and egos could dictate the details of our daily lives. And it was about what we were going to do next. Frustration simmered through the neighborhood like the sin of a grill that had suddenly gone cold. For many residents, the HOA's abrupt decision to ban outdoor cooking wasn't just annoying. It felt like an attack on personal freedom and community culture. Almost overnight, what had been a cherished weekend tradition turned into an unspoken act of defiance. Neighbors who used to wave to each other over backyard fences now found themselves gathering in hushed conversations, venting their disbelief and sharing theories about what was really behind the new rule. The general mood wasn't just irritation, it was betrayal. Everyone had their own breaking point. For some, it was the sheer absurdity of being told they couldn't grill a burger in their own backyard. For others, it was the principle of the thing, the complete lack of transparency, the feeling that a small group of board members had made a unilateral decision that affected everyone, without so much as an email or a meeting. Some residents had lived in the neighborhood for decades, raising families, hosting reunions, and celebrating birthdays with the smell of charcoal in the air. Now, those same activities were apparently a violation of community standards. People began to express their anger in subtle, symbolic ways. A few households started setting up their grills on the front lawn, not to cook, just to display them like protest signs. Others printed out copies of the HOA's letter and taped them to their doors with sarcastic annotations. One family hosted a cold food potluck, complete with cucumber sandwiches and passive-aggressive toasts to neighborhood harmony. The act of not grilling became a spectacle in itself, a daily reminder of what had been taken away and who had taken it. There was a deeper frustration, too, one that had less to do with BBQs and more to do with control. The ban had exposed a long-standing tension in the community, one that many had felt but few had named. Over the years, the HOA had slowly crept from useful to overbearing. What started as a way to keep the neighborhood tidy had become a mechanism for micromanagement. From lawn color to curtain visibility to mailbox style, the rules had piled up. Most people complied out of habit or exhaustion. But this time, something cracked. The barbecue ban wasn't just another rule, it was the one that made people stop and ask, why are we letting them do this to us? Even those who had never lit a grill in their lives began to feel uneasy. If the board could ban something as harmless and time-honored as backyard cooking, what would stop them from banning holiday decorations, or birthday parties, or swing sets that didn't meet some arbitrary aesthetic code? The overreach didn't just annoy people, it unsettled them. The board's silence only made things worse. Emails went unanswered. Requests for clarification were brushed off. The suggestion to bring up concerns at the next scheduled meeting felt like a stall tactic, not a path to resolution. Families with young kids, especially, were hit hard. Summer afternoons that had once been spent playing outside while parents grilled dinner turned into evenings indoors, with windows closed and tensions high. For many, those shared meals were more than just food. They were a pause from the noise of daily life, a ritual that brought everyone to the same table. Now, they were gone. And what replaced them wasn't peace or order, it was resentment. The ban also created a kind of divide, those who quietly supported the board's decision and those who openly opposed it. Conversations grew strained. Once friendly neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. Social cohesion, already fragile in a digital age, began to fray under the weight of this seemingly small but emotionally loaded decree. People weren't just mad, they felt powerless. And nothing eats at a community faster than that. The turning point came when someone decided to actually read the property deeds. It wasn't a lawyer or anyone from the HOA, it was Mark, the guy 3 houses down who works in construction and has a habit of keeping everything in labeled file boxes. He said the new barbecue ban didn't sit right with him, and instead of just complaining about it like the rest of us, he went digging. What he found changed everything. Our neighborhood, as it turns out, wasn't just governed by the HOA. There was a little-known detail buried in the original development documents. A federal easement ran straight through the center of the property. At first, most of us had no idea what that even meant. A federal easement? Sounded like one of those legal quirks no one ever talks about until it suddenly becomes relevant. Mark explained it in plain terms. The land our homes were built on had been part of a larger federal utility corridor back when the area was developed, and certain rights over that land remained under federal jurisdiction. Specifically, it meant that while the HOA could enforce aesthetic guidelines and maintain community facilities, they had no authority over activities deemed protected by federal public use rights, like cooking, gathering, or holding events, on parcels that intersected with the easement zone. Once that information got out, it spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had once felt cornered by the HOA's decision suddenly realized the board might have overstepped its authority. Maps were pulled, lot lines studied, and sure enough, nearly half the neighborhood fell within the federally protected zone. That included the main greenbelt where most of the weekend BBQs used to happen, as well as several individual backyards. What had seemed like an ironclad ruling by the HOA now looked more like an unenforceable overreach, at least on those portions of land governed by federal law. This discovery sparked a new wave of energy in the community. The conversations shifted from frustration to strategy. People began comparing deeds, pulling zoning documents from the county recorder's office, and even consulting with property rights advocates online. What was once an emotional argument about tradition had turned into a legal one backed by paperwork, maps, and clauses the HOA had apparently either ignored or never bothered to read. What made it even more striking was the fact that this easement wasn't exactly obscure. It was clearly outlined in the original sale documents for many of the homes. Mark pointed out that it had even come up during his own closing process years ago. But like most buyers, he hadn't thought much about it at the time. Now, though, it was a game-changer. It meant the HOA might have implemented a rule that didn't apply to a significant portion of the properties they claimed to regulate. And if they'd gotten this wrong, what else were they wrong about? The discovery had the effect of emboldening the neighborhood. People who had been quiet before, afraid of retaliation or just too tired to push back, began to speak up. There was a sense of leverage now, a shift in momentum. What had started as a passive frustration was quickly evolving into something more assertive. The community was beginning to realize that the HOA's authority wasn't absolute, and that their rights as property owners were more complicated and more protected than they had been led to believe. The federal easement wasn't a loophole. It was a line in the sand. And for the first time, residents saw it clearly. They weren't just arguing over burgers anymore. They were arguing over jurisdiction, over boundaries of power, over who actually had the right to say what they could or couldn't do on their own land. It was around this time that my uncle got involved, and everything changed. He wasn't just a family member. We liked to joke he was our in-house constitutional encyclopedia, always ready to quote obscure statutes at holiday dinners. But this time, it wasn't a joke. He'd worked for years as a compliance officer for a federal agency, and when he heard what was happening with the HOA and the barbecue ban, he didn't laugh. He asked for the HOA letter, the property deed, and a copy of the community covenants. Then he opened his laptop, rolled up his sleeves, and started taking notes. He didn't say much for the first few days. He just read, highlighted, cross-referenced, and occasionally asked questions. Has the board ever filed a jurisdictional claim on shared use areas? Did they notify residents before the policy change? Has anyone requested the minutes from the meeting where this was supposedly passed? The rest of us were still stuck in emotional outrage, but he was operating on a completely different level. Where we saw a power trip, he saw a legal vulnerability. And when he finally spoke up, he didn't waste words. They can't ban that, he said flatly. Not on federal land. And if they try to enforce it, they're opening themselves up to liability. That got everyone's attention. He explained it more clearly. Because the federal easement gave the public, us, certain use rights over our property, including cooking, gathering, and recreational use. The HOA's policy was not only unenforceable on those lots, but potentially illegal if enforced. He backed it all up with citations from federal land management policies, the easement agreement recorded with the county, and a long-forgotten clause in the HOA's own founding documents that stated their jurisdiction could not supersede federal land use rights. We didn't just take his word for it. He helped us draft a formal request to the HOA board, citing all the relevant laws and demanding an immediate suspension of the policy pending legal review. The letter was delivered with signatures from over a third of the homeowners, including some who had never attended a board meeting before. But my uncle didn't stop there. He filed an inquiry with the regional office of the Bureau of Land Management and requested confirmation that the easement in question remained under federal oversight. Within a week, he had his answer. Yes, it did. With that confirmation in hand, he filed what he called a federal use clarification order under the Freedom of Information Act, requesting that the HOA disclose any documentation that gave them the right to restrict use of land intersecting with the easement. The move was strategic. It wasn't just about asking for information. It was a way to put legal pressure on the board to acknowledge their overreach without us having to hire a lawyer or take them to court. It was clever, it was calm, and it was effective. The board's tone changed quickly. Suddenly, we started receiving emails acknowledging receipt of our concerns. A special session was announced to discuss community feedback regarding outdoor activity restrictions. No one said the word federal out loud, but you could feel it in the room when the meeting happened. The board, usually so confident and condescending, looked rattled. My uncle sat in the front row, binder in hand, as they stumbled through vague justifications and promises to review the policy further. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. His presence alone was a statement. What really shook them, I think, was the realization that someone in the neighborhood had both the knowledge and the nerve to challenge them. My uncle didn't yell or threaten. He just pointed to the facts and waited for them to blink. And for the first time in a long time, they did. The formal response from the HOA came 2 weeks later, and it was nothing like their usual bulletins. Gone was the condescending tone, the veiled threats of fines, and the heavy-handed language about uniformity and community safety. Instead, it was worded carefully, almost nervously. The board stated that they had reevaluated the policy in light of new information regarding property jurisdiction and had opted to temporarily suspend the outdoor cooking restrictions pending further legal clarification. It wasn't a full reversal, not yet, but it was the crack in the wall we had been waiting for. Behind the scenes, it was clear that the pressure had worked. My uncle's letter, packed with citations and backed by federal documentation, had done more than just rattle them. It had forced them to acknowledge that they might have overstepped their legal boundaries. The HOA, like many others, operated on a mix of confidence and compliance. Most of the time, residents didn't challenge rules, even unfair ones. But this time, they were up against facts. Real, printed, signed by the government facts. And they didn't have a defense. In the days that followed the suspension notice, the board began to shift its messaging. What had initially been framed as a safety regulation was now being described as a misinterpretation of policy scope. They claimed the ban was implemented in an attempt to maintain environmental consistency, and that it was never the board's intention to restrict federally protected uses. That part made a lot of people laugh, especially the ones who had been threatened with fines for grilling a steak just a few weeks earlier. But the important thing was they were retreating, and publicly. Then came the notice about the policy review hearing. This wasn't one of their usual HOA meetings with 5 people in a folding chair circle. This one was scheduled for a Saturday morning in the community center, with an open mic and time slots for residents to speak. The email announcing it included the phrase, "in partnership with homeowners," which was a dramatic departure from their usual top-down approach. It was a sign they knew they couldn't afford to act unilaterally anymore. The hearing was packed. More people showed up than anyone could remember attending an HOA event in years. Families brought lawn chairs, coolers, even thermoses of coffee like it was a tailgate party. People who hadn't spoken a word at any previous meeting were now taking turns at the microphone, reading statements, asking questions, and demanding transparency. Some were calm and factual. Others were emotional. A few were flat-out angry. But the message was the same. This ban never should have happened, and the board had no right to enforce it. My uncle didn't speak until the end. When he did, he wasn't dramatic. He simply restated what the law said, what the documents proved, and what the HOA had failed to do, namely, consult the legal limitations of their own authority before creating sweeping policies. He handed out copies of the federal confirmation letter to the board and thanked them, flatly, for their time. It was the most polite takedown anyone had ever seen, and the entire room knew it. A week later, the HOA released a final statement. The barbecue ban, they announced, was being formally revoked. They cited resident feedback and legal clarification as the reason and promised to review future policies with greater legal diligence and homeowner involvement. It was the most bureaucratic way they could admit defeat, but everyone understood what had really happened. They didn't just back down, they were forced to, and they knew it. The first weekend after the ban was lifted felt like a holiday that hadn't existed until that very moment. By Friday evening, grills were being rolled out onto driveways like parade floats. Smoke curled lazily over rooftops as people lit charcoals, twisted knobs on propane tanks, and unwrapped packs of marinated chicken and ribs that had been waiting in freezers for weeks. Music drifted from backyard speakers, kids zipped between sprinklers, and neighbors who hadn't spoken since the controversy began were suddenly clinking drinks and sharing potato salad. It was as if the neighborhood had exhaled all at once. But this wasn't just about food. It was about reclaiming a space that had been taken from everyone under the pretense of policy. The smell of grilled meat and the sight of people gathered around folding tables with paper plates were no longer just familiar. They were symbolic. What used to be routine now felt like quiet resistance, a statement that the community wasn't going to be pushed around anymore. Every sizzle from a grill was louder than any memo the HOA had ever written. People weren't just cooking, they were celebrating a win. It didn't take long for things to grow beyond individual backyards. On Saturday morning, someone posted in the neighborhood group chat, "How about a block barbecue?" Within hours, plans were in motion. Extension cords were laid out for speakers, extra tables were borrowed from garages, and every available cooler was packed with drinks and ice. No one waited for HOA approval this time. There were no sign-up sheets, no permits, no timid questions about rules. People just showed up, brought what they had, and made it happen. For the first time in a long time, the street felt like a community again. By late afternoon, the block party had come to life. Grills lined the sidewalk, smoke and laughter floated into the summer air, and neighbors mingled freely between setups. Someone brought a cornhole set, someone else set up a bubble machine for the kids, and homemade signs pointed to pulled pork, tacos, and vegan options like food festival booths. The HOA board didn't show up, at least not visibly, but a few members were seen watching from porches, expressions unreadable. Whether they were sulking or just absorbing the scene, no one cared. This wasn't about them anymore. The best part was the way everyone contributed. It didn't matter who had been outspoken during the fight or who had stayed silent. People brought sides, desserts, folding chairs, even an inflatable bounce house that no one admitted to owning. For a few hours, there were no factions, no cliques, no tension, just neighbors being neighbors. The conversations weren't just about what had happened. People were talking about what could happen next. More cookouts, movie nights on the Greenbelt, a community garden. Ideas flowed with the same freedom as the drinks. My uncle, of course, was there. Someone handed him a burger and slapped a local hero sticker on his shirt. He laughed it off, but I could tell it meant something. People came up to shake his hand, thank him, or just tell him how much they appreciated someone standing up when it counted. He didn't make a speech or take a victory lap. He just stood with a paper plate in one hand, quietly watching the smoke rise from half a dozen grills, a soft grin on his face like someone watching order being restored, not by force, but by food. As the sun went down and string lights flickered on over the cul-de-sac, someone started playing music from a Bluetooth speaker. Kids danced barefoot in the street. Adults leaned against cars and fences, swapping stories and recipes. It wasn't loud or wild or particularly fancy, but it was perfect. It was what the neighborhood had been missing. Not just the barbecue itself, but the space to come together, to exist without fear of being reprimanded for living normally. The ban had been a spark, but this was the fire that followed. And no board policy could put it out.